Prague, Kingdom of Bohemia, 1621. The axe falls, then falls again. Nobles die, knights are slain. Some have their hands chopped off, others are quartered and put on spikes. 27 leaders of the Bohemian Revolt, the Protestant uprising against the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, die one after the other. Ferdinand, it is said, plans to dominate and recatholicize Bohemia. He's ordered all Protestants to convert or leave. Back on the street, a common woman watches the executions unfold, axes and swords falling again and again. Then she goes home, and trying to make sense of what she's seen, opens her Bible to the book of Revelation. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder. One of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. She closes her book. This war, she knew, had only just begun. Thanks so much to Raycon and their everyday earbuds for helping our history come through loud and clear. The 30 Years' War was one of the most destructive periods in all of European history. 3 decades of bloodletting, massacre, and death that would not be surpassed in body count until the trenches of World War I. And that's an incredible concept, considering that the armies that went to war between 1618 and 1648 had none of the mechanized instruments of slaughter available in the 20th century. This was a war of pike and shot, where men went to battle hefting bladed weapons, or muskets so heavy that they required a forked stand to rest them on. Yet even with just these crude implements, up to 8 million people lost their lives. The death toll, however, did not fall equally in all places. Kicked off by a political-religious dispute in the Holy Roman Empire, the vast majority of the fighting took part in Central Europe, so the population there bore the heaviest share of the violence. In some areas, over half the population died, and the empire lost about 20% of its people. Civilian casualties outnumbered military deaths 7-1, and the Holy Roman Empire would take a century to recover its population. But describing in detail why this happened is difficult. In fact, we could spend an entire series just explaining why this war started, the early military campaigns, or how the Treaty of Westphalia ended it. Instead, we've decided to take a look at the 30 Years' War as a massive humanitarian crisis and explore why the body count reached such incredible heights. We'll look at factors like military violence and battles, but also starvation, poor harvests, weather conditions, and outbreaks of epidemic disease. And as a frame for all of this, we'll be using a device that many people in the worst affected lands turned to: apocalyptism. The 4 horsemen from the King James Bible, unleashed to scour a quarter of the earth, are an ideal way to divide the period's many dangers: conquest, war, famine, and death. And today, we'll be looking at the first: conquest. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, he not only sparked a religious reformation, he plunged Europe into what would become decades of religious war. Political units across the continent, from kingdoms like England and Bohemia down to levels of individual towns, broke out into struggles over both church doctrine and political power. And nowhere is this more true than the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, which quickly became a patchwork of majority Catholic and majority Lutheran provinces, towns, and cities. But war is a destructive and expensive endeavor, and by 1555, pretty much everyone was sick of it. So that year, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, part of the Habsburg family that had a lock on the position of emperor, signed a treaty with a League of Lutheran Princes in Augsburg, Germany. The Peace of Augsburg had a single idea at its heart, expressed by the phrase, "Whose realm, his religion." Meaning, essentially, the prince of a realm, whatever its size, could decide whether to be Catholic or Lutheran and enforce that religious conformity on his territory. Those that did not wish to convert would then move to an area whose prince practiced their chosen faith. And for a while, the Peace of Augsburg worked pretty well. The key words, of course, being "for a while." See, the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork anyway, comprised of not big provinces, but estates. Some only a few square miles, and not even continuous, where the head authority was a prince. Though in reality, these princes could be lords, counts, bishops, knights, abbots, or even a representative of a free city. Each of these had a vote at the imperial diet and was semi-autonomous. Then the emperors were elected by 7 elector princes, and as a result, had very little direct control over lands in the empire unless their family personally governed them. So, whose realm, his religion, was a fitting solution for this decentralized empire. And on a day-to-day basis, German Lutherans and Catholics became pretty used to each other. In fact, evidence indicates up to 20% of marriages crossed that theological division. Things were stable. Not without tension or danger, but people were able to navigate the chasm in their daily lives. But the Peace of Augsburg did leave out a Protestant group that even the Lutherans considered heretics: Calvinists, who, among other theological differences with Lutherans, argued that Jesus was only spiritually present in the bread and wine served during communion. Because Calvinists were not included in the Peace of Augsburg, they had no religious protections, even when under a Lutheran ruler, meaning their safety hinged on whoever was in charge and how lenient they were, which is how things kicked off in Bohemia in 1660. For nearly a decade, the Holy Roman Emperors had expanded Protestant rights in Bohemia. This included a pragmatic decree called the Letter of Majesty, granting religious freedom to the Bohemian estates and letting Bohemians develop what amounted to a state church. But in 1617, Holy Roman Emperor Matthias was sickly and childless, wanting to solve his succession issue before he passed on. So, he got the Bohemian states, which voted on their kings, to elect his cousin Ferdinand II as the next king of Bohemia after he died. Which was a problem, since it was well known that Ferdinand was a hardline Catholic who wanted to eradicate Protestantism within the empire. And once Ferdinand had gotten enough Lutheran princes on his side to win, the Calvinists were terrified. After all, Emperor Matthias was sick, and when he died, Ferdinand would not only become the King of Bohemia, he would also almost certainly be elected as Holy Roman Emperor. He'd lead the whole empire and also govern Bohemia directly. And that's when it all went out the window, literally. Because when Ferdinand sent a pair of hardline Catholic governors to administer Bohemia in his absence, a group of Bohemian Protestants met them at Prague Castle. After the pair read aloud a threatening letter from Ferdinand, the assembled Protestant nobles responded by throwing the pair out the window. Now, what happened next depends on who you believe. Catholic propagandists say that angels swept down to catch the governors, while Protestants said the men survived because they fell in a giant pile of dung. And then we have historians pointing out that they landed on a gradual slope and broke a lot of bones. With this second defenestration of Prague, that being a fancy word for throwing someone out a window, and yeah, this was the second time it happened, the 30 Years' War began. The revolt spread across Bohemia, which was already primed for religious war, and it might have stayed a local conflict, except that Matthias died, and Frederick did succeed as Holy Roman Emperor, causing panic amongst other Protestants in the empire. Then, sides formed. Austrian Protestants joined the rising, as did some in Germany. Bohemia attempted to join the Protestant Union, a group of Protestant estates in the empire that formed as a sort of mutual defense pact, and invited the Calvinist elector prince, Frederick V, to be king of Bohemia. Ferdinand, by turn, called in military aid from his cousin Philip III, the King of Spain, forming the Catholic League. This Catholic League marched on Austria, one of their armies headed by the Count of Tilly, a brilliant but ruthless commander. Then, on November 8, 1620, 27,000 Catholic troops stood outside Prague, the only thing in their way being 15,000 Bohemians on a low rise called White Mountain. The Bohemians crumpled, a flank attack sending their first units into retreat. Many rebels, seeing their fellows running, joined the rout without firing a shot. Then the Imperial cavalry surrounded and massacred them. 4,000 dead in an hour. Ferdinand had entered Prague as a conqueror, and the Habsburgs would personally govern Bohemia for the next 300 years. A few months later, the axes raised and fell on the rebel leaders. Frederick V went into exile, and the man who welcomed him to Prague had his tongue nailed to the city gate. But Ferdinand had pushed too far, and this would not stay a small regional conflict. For the second horseman was on his way to take peace from the earth. War. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given unto him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. Magdeburg, Holy Roman Empire, May 20th, 1631. A siege broken, a city burning. After months of grinding combat, Tilly's Imperial Army has smashed into the Protestant city. The Catholic League troops have set fires in the town, hoping that it will draw the city's garrisons away from the defensive walls. But then the wind turned those 10 burning buildings into 100, and now flames, rather than soldiers, have stormed Magdeburg. Thousands of civilians huddle in basements to try to escape the horror, but instead they die there, suffocated or burned. 1,000 luckier souls gather in the cathedral, sure that the Catholic attackers will not burn it. But instead, in their relative safety, they're forced to watch as gangs of soldiers rob, torture, and murder the population. Only 200 of the city's 1,700 buildings survive, as 20,000 men, women, and children die in a scene ripped straight from hell. One reason Prague fell so quickly in 1619 is that their attempts to join an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany never really worked. Whether the empire's Protestants liked it or not, the Catholic Ferdinand II had won the election as King of Bohemia fairly, and most German Lutherans were not in favor of backing an uprising and breaking their entire political system just to give the Calvinist Frederick V the crown. Better to just wait and elect a new king after Ferdinand passed away. And if Ferdinand had been careful, it could have gone that way and stayed a local conflict. But then he started engaging in the most Habsburg of hobbies: empire building. Before becoming the rebel king of Bohemia, Frederick V had been, and still technically was, the Elector Prince of the Palatinate, able to vote for the position of Holy Roman Emperor. But since Frederick was now technically a rebel and a traitor, Ferdinand decided to occupy the Palatinate, to strip Frederick of his vote, and instead give it to his brother-in-law, Maximilian of Bavaria. Now, Ferdinand had many Lutherans on his side during the Bohemian Revolt, but this was a clear breach of the empire's rules. And when Catholic armies, including Spanish troops, marched into the Palatinate with Maximilian at their head, things really kicked off, and other countries began getting involved. The Netherlands, which had recently revolted against Spain and won their independence, now saw that war resumed and get folded into the larger conflict. And the Dutch, at war with Habsburg Spain, suddenly warmed to the exiled Calvinist Frederick V and decided to bankroll his war against Ferdinand and Habsburg Austria. Meanwhile, James I of Great Britain, whose daughter was married to Frederick, threatened Spanish shipping if his son-in-law's titles were not restored. And actually, Spain was, in fact, interested in negotiating, not wanting to spend itself on Ferdinand's behalf. And so the two worked out a compromise that would have prevented the war, giving back Frederick some of his land and passing the electoral vote to his son instead. But neither Frederick nor Ferdinand accepted the deal, and the war began in earnest. And look, I know that was a lot of information, but here's why we're getting into the weeds. This is how the conflict went from a constitutional crisis in the Holy Roman Empire to a black hole that sucked in soldiers from across Europe. And if you're thinking this is all starting to sound a lot like 1914, with a local conflict drawing Europe into war, you most certainly aren't alone. In fact, soldiers in World War I thought the very same thing. But here's where politics really step in. Because while we throw around names like Spain, Austria, and Great Britain, in the 17th century, nationalism was still in its infancy. Religion, ideology, family bonds, or money often meant more than patriotic ties.
At Ralph's Pharmacy, our pharmacists are vaccine experts. Don't know what you need? We can help. We have COVID, shingles, pneumonia, and more vaccines. Wondering if you're covered? Ralph's accepts most insurance plans. You heard it right. Our vaccine experts make it easy to get vaccinated, so you can keep being an expert in what you're passionate about. Ralph's, a world of care is in store. Learn more at ralphs.com/vaccine. Services and availability vary by location. Age and other restrictions may apply. For coverage, consult your health insurance company. Visit the pharmacy or our site for details.
In fact, rather than thinking of countries, it's often more helpful to think about the leading families of each nation. The Stuarts in Great Britain, the Bourbons in France, and of course, the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. And another thing about the Habsburgs, they were not well liked. Controlling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, they surrounded France, meaning that though the Bourbons were Catholic, they were also the Habsburgs' greatest enemies. Similarly, the Habsburgs' hardline Catholic policies set them against Protestant countries and even alienated parts of their own empire. Not to mention they were also big into absolutist rule and the divine right of kings, to the point that Ferdinand's ultimate goal was to turn the Holy Roman Empire from a constitutional confederation of small states that elected a ruler who had limited power to one where he had direct control and could enforce religious uniformity. To put it simply, he wanted to make his territory a Catholic land. Even the Pope, who you'd expect to be down for this sort of program, felt queasy at the prospect. After all, he was also a prince of a small Italian kingdom, and he didn't exactly want a massively powerful absolutist state directly to his north. So over the course of the conflict, he'd gradually align himself more and more alongside France. Frederick, for his part, and with the financial support of the Dutch and British, managed to keep the Protestant cause alive in German lands, despite defeat after defeat from the Catholic League. In 1625, Denmark intervened, and its King Christian IV led 20,000 troops into Germany. But his success was short-lived, and 4 years later, Denmark was knocked out of the war. And then came the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, entering the war with pamphlets and speeches, trumpeting himself as the savior of Protestant Europe. But the Germans didn't really think so. Partially because the German population was starting to get wise to the consequences of having so many armies marching and battling through their lands. Namely, that looting, sexual assault, theft, murder, and violence against civilians quickly became commonplace during the conflict. The destruction of Magdeburg, which opened this episode, being the most famous incident. Yet, that's not surprising, right? This was a religious war, and therefore you'd expect a level of sectarian violence and massacre. But that's not exactly true, because this violence was almost universally about money. See, the vast majority of the troops in this conflict were professional soldiers who signed up expecting to be paid. Expecting being the key word there. Because while all of these nations fielded armies, they quickly realized they couldn't reliably supply or pay them. A problem that only worsened as the conflict
soldier.
stretched
Welcome
longer
to
and
me on the
longer.
shop.
Even Spain, with access to American silver, couldn't keep up. And in the absence of official pay, soldiers just started to, take stuff. Granted, with a veneer of legitimacy, like Christian IV, who became famous for sending cities ransom notes demanding that they pay up or be sacked. Also, Catholic churches were a favorite target of his armies, with troops stripping gold and silver ornamentation before marching on. In fact, Christian himself liked to confiscate reliquaries containing bones of saints, open them up, give the bones back to the church, and take the box. It also happened unfairly. Troops broke into besieged cities and plundered them, stealing anything of value and torturing civilians to find where they'd hidden any wealth. Also, soldiers would raid villages and take livestock when their commanders couldn't come up with food. And when a city that initially refused to surrender fell, it was well known that it would be looted for days. In fact, one man who survived the fall of Magdeburg as a child recalled 5 or 6 waves of soldiers coming into their house and demanding money. And when his family convinced a kind Catholic soldier to take them out of the city, he witnessed the fate of those who hadn't had anything to give the marauders. Corpses lay naked in the street, with several women drowned headfirst in a beer barrel. And when they finally arrived at the enemy camp, he remembers the soldier's wife scolding him for coming back with refugees rather than spoils of war. Granted, commanders did try to discourage this behavior. In fact, one of the most enduring pieces of art from the conflict, a series of etchings called The Miseries of War, famously shows a tree thick with the bodies of hung looters. But this was not a humanitarian gesture on the part of generals. They were more concerned that looting caused breakdowns in discipline and made armies vulnerable as men broke out of their units and spread out to pillage. But no matter how many men were hanged, it didn't change the fact that soldiers of all sides were frequently unpaid, undersupplied, and left to fend for themselves. And all that looting, which took place over and over as multiple militaries marched through the lands, begot another problem. Because when the armies trudged away, carrying sacks of grain, chicken, and pigs, just as harvest season came and the first snowflakes began to fall, that was when the third horseman would arrive. The deadliest so far, famine. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Southern Germany, 1624. Hunger. It greeted the man at dawn and lay down with him at dusk. Sometimes its gnawing woke him up at night. Even before the war, cold weather had made bad harvests. Then the emperor came, took land, and debased the coin to pay his mercenaries. The bread price quadrupled. And that was all before soldiers sacked his house and carried off the family cattle. Now there was only hunger. Hunger and the dead, and a terrible solution. Periodic famine was a regular occurrence in 17th century Europe. Natural events like extreme weather, insect infestation, or botanical disease could cost a harvest. But while going hungry wasn't unheard of, like many things about the 30 Years' War, it was the scale of the famine that ensures it's still remembered to this day. And as we continue our investigation of the 30 Years' War as a humanitarian disaster, we have to examine the role hunger played. Even without the war, the 17th century was a lean one for Central Europe, sitting at the center of the Little Ice Age, a time where, for uncertain reasons, temperatures dropped several degrees in the northern hemisphere. Now, theories about why include the Earth's orbit and tilt, increased volcanic eruptions, or changes in oceanic circulation. But no matter what the cause, the end result was that European farms likely saw decreased crop productivity and shortened growing seasons, so there was just less food to go around, period. And then came the Kipper and Vipper years, one of the most unbelievable economic crises in the history of Europe. Now, I know that's an odd term, but there's really no current-day English equivalent. What exactly Kipper and Vipper stands for varies on the telling, but one leading theory states that Kipper refers to clipping coins, more on that in a minute, and Vipper means a sort of seesaw, a reference to the scales of the money changers. The Holy Roman Empire, you see, didn't have a single currency. Southern Germany had silver and gold coins they favored, and Northern Germany used two different coins, which we're not going to differentiate here to make things simpler. Both, however, theoretically, did have pennies. But in reality, they cost so much to produce that the state gave up, and people mostly imported foreign coins instead, which was normal since Germany was a trade crossroads. And this was a period where certain trading towns might have dozens of foreign currencies in circulation due to traders passing through. Now, no one knows where they came from. Suspects include Sweden and Italy. But in the late 1500s, some debased foreign coins had made their way into the Holy Roman Empire. Now, taking a step back for a moment, what does it mean for a coin to be debased, you might ask? Well, simply put, it means that the gold and silver coin contained less of the precious metal than they were supposed to. And because people in the empire kept trading their non-debased gold and silver coins for debased ones, the states as a whole were losing money. So then rulers began debasing their own coins to try to even everything out, but the end result being that by 1609, the value of the empire's silver coins fell by 20%. Of course, there are a few different ways to debase coinage. One involves mixing other metals into them, bringing down the silver and gold content of each coin so you can make more coins with less precious metal. But another one is clipping coins, shaving or cutting edges off of them, and then melting down those scraps to make brand new coins. And in an economic system that relies on a coin literally being worth its weight in silver and gold, both those tactics are dangerous. They literally make money worth less than advertised. Now, even back then, it was known that bad currency drives out good, making people hoard non-debased coinage, or for governments to debase their own coin in competition. But in the short term, debasing could have its benefits. You have 8,000 coins, then you debase them, and now you have 10,000 coins. You just upped your assets 25%, which is useful if you need to hire or pay, I don't know, let's take a shot in the dark here, a bunch of soldiers. You see where this is going. Even before the war began, a lot of city mints, with minimal imperial oversight, were already debasing their coins. Ferdinand pursued that policy for Bohemia even before the revolt, and afterward, the Catholic nobles he brought in to replace the exiled Protestant ones kicked it into high gear. But debasing became especially attractive once the war began, and states came under strain funding their defense. But it was also both a way to enrich those doing it and practice economic sabotage. Nobles, town leaders, and even priests would start their own unofficial mints, clipping good coins or producing bad ones. Then those with the highest gold and silver content they would keep. And the rest? Well, they'd get a traveling con man to bring them to the next state over, preferably one that supported the opposite cause, and convince common people to exchange their good coins for the debased ones. It essentially became a race to the bottom, with each state trying to dump bad coins on the neighbors, take the neighbors' non-debased coins back, and debase them to make more money. And the result was a total collapse of the currency. Some coins fell to 1/8 of their value, and hyperinflation went out of control. Bread prices were particularly dire. In one diary from the period, a soldier claims that 45 silver pieces could only buy 2 pounds of bread, and a seminary student in a university town remembered a loaf costing a full gold piece. And some of the biggest perpetrators of this were major figures in the war. Ferdinand, as we mentioned, championed debasing Bohemian coin to pay his soldiers, but when he moved his Catholic lords into Bohemia, nearly all of them set up mints to make a quick buck. The most successful of which was Albrecht von Wallenstein, who invested money he'd inherited from his wife into mints in Bohemia, using the profits to set up a mini fiefdom in the country and raise a private army. Then using this very literal war chest, he became one of the most influential imperial generals of the conflict. Though Imperial Edict finally fixed the exchange rate in 1623, there was no undoing the damage. Urbanized classes like merchants and tradesmen were ruined, with food prices rising eightfold. And because they lived in cities, they had no farms to grow their own food. Areas like Bohemia were hit even worse, since Ferdinand's religious policies were driving out the moneyed classes of Protestant artisans and skilled workers. It left the country short of doctors, lawyers, merchants, and builders. They in turn fled to Protestant cities, driving prices even higher there, since more population means more demand for food. And then came the soldiers. Soldiers that had to be paid, often by rulers ordering tax hikes on their already destitute subjects. Generals routinely took on more soldiers than they could pay, making up for the shortfall with contributions from the cities they marched into, essentially demanding money in exchange for not sacking the town. Armies also quartered soldiers in civilian homes, at times for months, with families made to provide for the unwelcomed house guests. And of course, there was also the looting, pillaging, and confiscation of crops and livestock, which was pretty rampant. But that was micro scale. On a macro level, once the monarchs began running out of money, they started paying troops in land. Ferdinand was the first to do this, granting Maximilian lands in the Palatinate for the use of his army. But there were others, and new rulers, unfamiliar with the territory, did little to even out the situation. Accounts of the time discussed nuns corralling orphans into convent grounds, begging passing troops for food, families trying to eat grass, and cats and dogs disappearing from cities. Soldiers, often just as hungry, lamed or poisoned their horses so they could be butchered for food. And because sieges were such a feature of the conflict, garrisons found themselves running low on supplies much earlier than normal. It was mostly from here that the stories of cannibalism came. And while we shouldn't believe every one of them, it's generally accepted that it happened on occasion. The poor eating each other, and the rich making more money. But that was not the end. There was still one final horseman left. Because while armies marched from town to town, taking whatever they wished, they often left something in their wake. Plague, pestilence, and death. The rider on the pale horse is coming, and his scythe will kill more than the other horsemen combined. Lutzen, Electorate of Saxony, November 17, 1632. Yesterday, Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus clashed with imperial forces under Wallenstein and Pappenheim on the field, fighting in heavy mist. The Protestants emerged victorious. The imperial invasion of Saxony stopped, but at a terrible cost. Pappenheim fell to a cannonball, and King Gustavus, his unit lost in the fog, was surrounded, killed, and his body stripped. 20,000 others lay slain. And today, the men and women of Lutzen bury the dead in mass graves. But as terrible as the violence of the field, it's nothing compared to what the two armies have unwittingly unleashed upon Saxony. Plague. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. We now come to the final element in our exploration of why the 30 Years' War proved to be so destructive: disease. Much like famine, epidemic disease was a common fixture of 17th century life. Even in times without war, local breakouts due to poor sanitation, or even waves of disease brought via trade networks happened periodically. In fact, even before the war, Germany had seen 3 waves of bubonic plague between 1607 and 1611. And with the lack of medical knowledge about the cause and treatment of disease, rates of serious illness and mortality were much higher. And actually, it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that armies would suffer more deaths in combat than from what were known as camp diseases. Because when you rally an army in the 17th century, you draw a large number of people together who are mostly strangers, including some from isolated villages or hamlets that may not have the same immunities as people from urban areas or well-trafficked trade routes. Then add in the often unhygienic conditions of military life, living in tents, open latrine pits, contaminated water sources, and poor or old food, and you have the perfect recipe for gastrointestinal diseases like dysentery. Likewise, a lack of hygiene, inability to change clothes, and the necessity of living close to pack animals, livestock, and cavalry mounts led to outbreaks of lice that carried typhus and bubonic plague. And wherever troops marched, they passed on those diseases to the local population. Now, this was to some extent a normal feature of conflict at the time, but the 30 Years' War added an extra layer with its international nature. For instance, just with the Bohemian Revolt, imperial armies from Germany and Spain marched into Bohemia, bringing in new strains of disease from outside. Then, as the war progressed, the Dutch came, and the Swedish, and the French. But also remember that these national terms don't really mean much, since many of the troops were mercenaries recruited abroad. Scotsmen marched in the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, and Italians with the Spanish. Then as the war dragged on, and more forces got involved, the waves of epidemic disease got increasingly deadly. Typhus and dysentery existed at a fairly moderate level throughout the conflict, and a bubonic plague outbreak in 1625 and 1626 tore through both armies and citizenry, killing several prominent generals. Yet it was the Swedish intervention under King Gustavus Adolphus in 1631 when things entered a new phase, both politically and medically. Because there were just more troops, more foreign allies, bigger battles, and increasingly, armies marching through the same area over and over and over. Bubonic plague exploded. It swept the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, depopulating villages as residents tried to defeat the mysterious infection, sometimes only to carry it with them to wherever they found sanctuary. Populations displaced by war or military pillaging swelled nearby cities, creating new sanitation crises there that led to more typhus and dysentery outbreaks alongside the plague. And of course, the widespread famine lowered the immune systems of both soldiers and civilians, exacerbating the spread of disease. Plague began having major strategic consequences. In 1633, a Spanish army struck out from northern Italy, crossing the Alps to attack Rhine. Instead of battling the enemy, however, it found itself decimated by bubonic plague. 2 years later, a French army would fall to the same fate when invading the Spanish Netherlands, with 17,000 soldiers dying or deserting, due not to the conflict, but camp disease. And Frederick V, who had helped kick off the conflict by accepting the crown of Bohemia from the rebels, died of an unknown infection in 1632, mere weeks after Gustavus died in Lutzen. Now, casualty numbers are notoriously difficult to wrestle with when it comes to the 30 Years' War. They can vary widely depending on what satellite conflicts they include, and local records are often unreliable. But in one study of civilian death records, a staggering 64% of deaths during the war came from bubonic plague. The result, utter devastation. Frankfurt, May 7th, 1636. Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel and Surrey, is an Englishman in a strange country. A diplomat under orders from King Charles I. He's likely beginning to wonder who it is exactly he's supposed to be talking to. On their boat trip along the main river to Frankfurt, his party passed numerous burned towns and castles ruined from siege. Changing to carriages at Frankfurt and hiring musketeers for protection, they strike south into rough country, hearing cannon fire over the horizon. It's nearly dark when they enter the village. Its name, he notices, translates to New Church. And there is a church, as well as several houses, one that's on fire. They call out announcing their presence, but no one answers. Faraway shots echo in the darkening trees. With the sun going down and the nearest town 4 miles away, they decide to stay the night. Their musketeers patrol in the suffocating dark, and Howard's servants cook his meals over timbers dragged from the burning house. Then, after a very tense evening, at first light, they start to investigate. The houses are all empty, not a soul remaining. Then, Howard himself goes to the small church and opens its double doors. The interior is ransacked, its altar and sacred images torn and defiled, and when he steps out into the churchyard, he sees a body scraped out of its grave by scavengers. Whether beasts or human ones, he cannot guess. Another body lies outside the fence. They hurry on, and it's only at their next stop that they learn the tale. It was not war that killed the village. It was plague. One family had succumbed, and rather than risk infection, the villagers had fled, stopping only to torch the affected house so travelers would not catch the disease. While Howard's account, or rather the account of his secretary, is unique in its texture and detail, the event itself was not uncommon. Things like it happened all over the Holy Roman Empire as the panic set in. And that panic, as panics often do, went to strange places. Some manifested as apocalyptic beliefs, or through deep racism and violence towards foreigners or outsiders. A rash of witch hunting broke out in the Empire, mostly centered in places that, ironically, had been the least affected by the conflict, because the people on the front line of the misfortune and tragedy were generally too exhausted for the labor and energy-intensive campaigns of trials, burnings, and hangings. But those eaten up by anxiety about what could happen tomorrow channeled that fear into religious panic and violence. Yet it was not just the civilians living in the Empire who were exhausted. After 3 decades of conflict, most of the participating nations were also running on empty. Many participants had expanded their military might, drained their treasuries, and had been forced to put down revolts over increased taxes at home. Spain was broke, France was too, and in England, the financial burdens of the war and Charles's attempts to boost the treasury without calling Parliament helped lead Great Britain into civil war. Plus, almost none of the political players who started the conflict were even still alive, and the whole conception about the war had shifted. While it had begun as a political-religious conflict, when Catholic France entered the fray on the side of the Protestant states, it quickly changed into a war about trying to counter and contain Habsburg power in Europe. And crucially, by the mid-1640s, the war had reached an equitable stalemate. Now, there had been numerous times, after the Bohemian Revolt died, after the Danish were knocked out, or when Saxony made peace with Ferdinand, when the powers could have just said, "Enough's enough," and ended the slaughter. But at each point, one side was always just in too good of a position. Better to keep throwing troops into the meat grinder and make up for what's been lost. But now, everyone had a slice of the pie. Everyone had a negotiating position. By 1648, the Four Horsemen had run their course, and it was time, finally, to make peace, to draft a treaty at Westphalia.
Greetings, old. Now you've got a denial, my
1643,
friend.
Westphalia.
Look at this beauty
Representatives
here. A fine
gathered,
soblet,
diplomats
sharp
of the
enough to
Holy
split
Roman
the ears
Empire,
a
of
flea's
Spain,
backside.
of Sweden and
This little
Denmark,
beast is no
of
ordinary
Bavaria
man,
and
no, no.
Brandenburg.
Forged from
After
the finest
years
steel
of
and honed to
negotiation,
perfection.
political and
She's
religious
seen her share
argument, and
battles
bartering,
against the stubborn
they
lords
finally seeked
and
to end
planks
the
inside
most
the Highlands.
destructive war Europe
Let me
has
tell you
ever
something,
seen.
lad.
A
This
war
blade isn't
that
just
through
for
plague,
cutting wood. No, no.
massacre,
If you
and
find yourself in a
famine has
pinch,
almost
this soblet can
become
make
a
fearsome
force in
weapon.
itself.
A swing of this,
And I
will
saw
tear
an
through foes
angel
like a
come
hot
down
knife
from
through
heaven,
butter.
having the keys of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up. And a seal set upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, when he would be unleashed again. A kingdom shattered, millions dead, and an endless conflict, draining the finances and manpower of all who took part. How to put the demon back in the bottle. As long as the 30 Years' War remained a conflict centered on religion, it was a difficult thing to resolve. After all, the parties believed that as far as spiritual matters were concerned, there was an immutable right and wrong, orthodoxy and heresy with little room for accommodation. Even those who fought primarily for money or power had to cloak their motives in religion, making political compromise difficult, especially when external forces like the Catholic Church or larger Protestant neighborhoods had their say. But nearly 2 decades into the conflict, that started to break down. In 1634, representatives of Emperor Ferdinand and the Protestant state of Saxony met at Prague Castle to try and resolve the religious and political questions that had originally torn apart the Holy Roman Empire. And they actually hammered out a deal most
greetings,
imperial
soldier.
states could accept.
Welcome to my humble shop.
Emperor Ferdinand
Please, take a
agreed to
going.
walk back his counter-Reformation campaign, where he tried to stamp out Lutheranism and restore the religious map
greetings,
as it
soldier.
had been at the Peace of Augsburg. Saxony, in turn, agreed that its army would be part of the larger army of the empire, and that it would no longer make formal alliances with other states of the empire or outside powers. There was also an amnesty for everyone who'd fought against the emperor, apart from the heirs of the now dead Frederick V. It was a reasonable peace, and other states of the empire joined in when the agreement went into force in 1635. However, there was a place where it didn't play well: France. Though Catholic and hostile to Protestants within France, King Louis XIII was an avowed enemy of the Habsburgs, and he feared being encircled by Spanish Habsburg territory in Spain, Italy, and the separate Habsburg branch ruling the Holy Roman Empire. And really, a strengthened Holy Roman Empire on his eastern border wasn't really what he wanted to see. So in 1635, he instructed his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, to enter the war on the side of the Protestants and attack Spain. It was a move that changed the entire nature of the war, turning a conflict of Protestant and Catholic states into one of pro- and anti-Habsburg factions. And with Spain tied down and the prospect of Protestant victory renewed, Sweden took the opportunity to jump back into the war. But it was different this time. There was an end goal in sight. Grab enough territory to come to the negotiating table and hopefully build on the Peace of Prague in order to achieve political goals. The tide swung in the anti-Habsburg faction's favor in 1640, and in 1641, Cardinal Richelieu was entertaining Habsburg envoys who tried to make a separate peace with France, but Richelieu insisted that all the allies must come to peace at the same time. And after a bit of wrangling, they decided on a place, the state of Westphalia. There they declared that two cities were to be exempt from the raging war to serve as negotiating centers. The universally Catholic city of Münster and the Protestant-controlled Osnabrück, where they started to work on a treaty that would reshape Europe, even as the war continued to rage around them. But don't start imagining the United Nations here. You know, like with everybody in the same big room. This is still the 17th century after all, where communications and travel are incredibly slow, people get sick, and ambassadors have to wait for orders. The first delegations arrived in 1643, and various ambassadors from major nations like France, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain, plus representatives of small states in the Holy Roman Empire, just sort of filtered through for the next 6 years, trying to create a compromise everyone would accept. There were even side treaties. Spain and the Dutch Republic, for instance, ended the 80 Years' War, which had merged with the 30 Years' War, with Spain formally recognizing Dutch independence, but also winning religious tolerance for Dutch Catholics. And those same questions about religion fed into the other treaties made at Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War. The agreement went by one simple principle: who rules his religion? No, you heard me right. After millions dead and decades of compounding misery, we are right back at the Peace of Augsburg. Glad we all did that, right, everybody? Okay, to be fair, there were a few key differences. Now, in addition to Catholic or Lutheran, rulers could choose to be Calvinist, and members of minority religions were free to practice in private or even in public during certain times allowed by the state. Hereditary Habsburg lands were exempt, however, they would be Catholic. But there were two even more difficult questions. How would the Holy Roman Empire's constitution change? And who would get the land that had changed hands? And here's where the war comes into the picture. Because as the negotiations dragged on, the war tilted in favor of the anti-Habsburg faction. By 1648, Protestant armies were marching back into Prague Castle, marking the last major battle of the war and leaving the Imperial Spanish faction not much to negotiate with. Ferdinand III, son of the now dead Ferdinand II, was forced to give up much of the centralized power his father had seized, strengthening the German states and keeping the empire fragmented and difficult to control. A major foreign policy win for France. Plus, individual states of the empire could make treaties with each other, and France and Sweden now serve as guarantor of the empire's constitution. Meaning, if Frederick tried to pull what his father had by shifting electoral votes, Sweden and France would invade the empire. And then came the land. That was the stickiest part, because as you'll recall, both Catholic and Protestant factions had started rewarding generals and sometimes troops with land. Unsurprisingly, these folks didn't want to give it up. But in the end, secular lands went back to who owned them in 1618, and church lands went to whoever owned it in 1624. So, Ferdinand got to keep Bohemia as part of his family lands, even though a Protestant army had just marched into it. But there were territorial changes, mostly favoring the anti-Habsburg faction. Sweden got territory that helped it control the Baltic Sea and major rivers. France got Alsace and areas it had taken a century earlier, but were now formally recognized. The Protestant state of Brandenburg got bigger and more powerful, as did the southern Catholic state of Bavaria, which kept the Upper Palatinate. The Lower Palatinate? That went back to Frederick V's son. It was a peace that hobbled the possibility of German unification for another 2 centuries, and set Brandenburg, later known as Prussia, and Bavaria on a course to be Germany's dominant power players. The empire's center of rule shifted to Vienna, and with its new territory, France could threaten invasion whenever it wished. But while it's true that the treaty was trying to constrain Habsburg power, one has to be a little careful how you discuss the Peace of Westphalia. Later German nationalists, from Bismarck to the Nazis, would cast the treaty as part of a narrative of victimization, spinning it that the rest of Europe was trying to keep the German nation and its people down. But in reality, no single sense of nationhood or commonality existed at the time. After all, this had been a civil war. And speaking of later interpretations, looking back, Westphalia was also a landmark because it set some precedent for the idea of state sovereignty. The concept that a government controlling a piece of territory should be free to govern that area and its people as it sees fit without interference from other states. In fact, the Treaty of Westphalia has often been cited as a step toward the international order we have now, where secular authority supersedes religious power, countries control all within their
greetings,
borders,
soldier.
and diplomacy is
Welcome to my
conducted
humble shop.
via a sole
Please, take
designated
a look at my
official,
interest
and not by
And
a
no
horde
other
of nobles
details
who
which
throw
side
someone
you're on,
out a window.
just so long as you
Step
fill
in the
my
right
pockets,
direction. Now, of course, exactly how big a step it was toward our modern world is still debated by historians. But at the time, one thing was certain. The Peace of Westphalia had stopped one of the most terrible wars Europe would ever witness. And though there would be more conflicts, it would not be until 1914, when a very different Europe, one with Germany, rather than the Holy Roman Empire at its center, would see the Four Horsemen ride again.
Of course, we wouldn't hear the Four Horsemen again.
The artist's hands shake as he sets up his easel and paints. Across from him sits a man infamous throughout the land. Some call him a hero, the only man willing to defend Eastern Europe from the armies of the Ottoman Sultan, while others say he's a monster, a fiend, who impales men, women, and children on long spikes and feasts beneath their jerking corpses. And according to one story, he dips his bread in the warm blood that splatters his plate. This legend in front of the artist has a face that matches the stories. A sharp nose, heavy eyebrows, and bulging green eyes. For over a decade, the man has been a captive. But soon, he'll be unleashed again. Vlad III, son of the dragon, Dracula.
Though before we take a bite out of this legendary tale, we want to thank Nebula for helping to make this episode possible. And remind you that after this episode, you should go check out our next Extra History series on Nazi occultism over there a full week earlier than anywhere else by clicking the link below.
Welcome, friends! Today, we will be discussing Vlad the Impaler, aka Dracula, a 15th century Romanian ruler who... Vlad, I'm doing a bit. All right. Take the bangs out. Kind of hurt anyway. Actually, it's for the best, because as fun as it is to make vampire jokes, the true story of Vlad the Impaler is actually more interesting, revealing, and dare I say bloody, than the literary counterpart that stole his name. Vlad III, later known as the Impaler, is by far the most famous Romanian historical figure. But he's famous in a strange sense. In his homeland, he's a national hero, seen as a champion of independence and resistance against Ottoman expansion. But outside Romania, he's mostly perceived as the psychopath and sadist that inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, word of his violent deeds spread even during his lifetime, as printmakers in Germany pointed out exaggerated or invented stories about him. In other words, centuries before Stoker's birth, Vlad's story was already intertwined with myth, which makes him difficult to talk about. So just to state this up front, our plan with this series is to first discuss the historical Vlad, and then do a separate episode on the complex legacy of his memory, where yes, we promise we'll talk about all the Dracula stuff. Because actually, Dracula is Rob's favorite classic novel.
And we did an entire episode on that book on our literary show, So You Haven't Read. It's awesome, I love it, and you should definitely go take a bite out of that after you finish learning about Vlad.
But okay, back to history. To understand Vlad the Man, we have to go back to the time of his father, Vlad II, known as Dracul, or the Dragon. Vlad Dracul got that name after Sigismund, king of Hungary, and later the Holy Roman Emperor, made him a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order that vowed to defend Eastern Europe from the Ottoman Empire. These two, they were close. See, Vlad II grew up as a hostage at Sigismund's court, a common practice then, which was half like going to boarding school and half like, well, being a hostage. Vlad's father, the ruling prince of Wallachia, had agreed to be a vassal of the Hungarian king, with Vlad living within decapitating distance of the Hungarian throne to keep his father honest, i.e., betray me and I kill your kid. Yet Sigismund was pretty chummy with Vlad, educating him and showing him favor. Because Sigismund's ideal outcome wasn't for Vlad to die, it was for him to succeed his father and rule Wallachia as a close ally of Hungary. But why? I mean, why would Hungary, much larger than it is today, put so much effort into controlling a relatively small principality? Well, as they say in real estate, location, location, location. Wallachia was, essentially, the buffer zone for a major conflict brewing in Eastern Europe. the expansionist Ottoman Empire had rolled over the Balkans, and the then powerful Kingdom of Hungary wanted a friendly ruler in Wallachia to keep it free of Ottoman control and the famous Ottoman janissaries off Hungary's borders. But the throne of Wallachia was a bit of a mess, and keeping anyone on it was a big project. Vlad Dracula's own father had been prince twice before he died in 1418, and 5 other of Vlad's cousins and half-brothers had also sat on the throne by 1436, some multiple times. That's because monogamy was more of a suggestion for Wallachian nobles rather than a strict rule, and that created an enormously twisted family tree of backstabbing and usurpation that meant the average time on the throne during Vlad Dracula's lifetime was only around 2 to 3 years. But it wasn't until 1434 that Sigismund thought about a regime change. That's of course when one of Vlad's brothers, currently the prince, sent envoys to pledge allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan. In response, Sigismund gave Vlad a bunch of money to raise an army of exiled Wallachian boyars, basically the nobles, to seize the throne. He succeeded in 1436, mostly because of brother died of illness, and Vlad's first act was to cancel the treaty his predecessor had drawn up with the Ottomans. Then, 2 things happened. First, the Ottomans invaded in response, then a month later, Sigismund died, triggering a Hungarian internal crisis that meant Wallachia wasn't going to be getting any of its promised military aid. So, Vlad Dracul decided to forego that whole Order of the Dragon, Battle the Turks thing, pledged fealty to Murad II, and guided an Ottoman army into Hungary. But that Ottoman force was defeated, leaving the Hungarians furious with Vlad. See, the problem that would bedevil Vlad, and his son Dracula as well, was that Wallachia was a small country between big powers, and siding with one invited the other to either attack him militarily or to try to put another relative on the Wallachian throne. In 1442, Vlad took a meeting with John Hunyadi, a Hungarian vassal and Prince of Transylvania, remember him, he's important, who convinced Vlad to withdraw his support from a planned Ottoman invasion of Transylvania. Vlad, hoping to stay neutral, didn't join the invasion, but did let Murad's forces cross Wallachia to attack Hunyadi. Now, it was Murad II who was furious with Vlad, and when he called him in for an explanation, he jailed him along with his 2 youngest sons, only releasing him to reclaim his throne once he'd sworn not to act against Ottoman interests, and pledged to send 500 children a year to join the elite Ottoman Janissary Corps. But when he was released from Ottoman custody, he left a few things behind. Namely, his 11-year-old son Vlad III, known by his preferred honorific of Dracula, or Son of the Dragon. Oh, that's right, just like Daddy Dragon got ditched as a hostage at Sigismund's court, this little dragon got left as a hostage with the Ottomans, along with his brother Radu, who was around 7. And these 2 brothers wouldn't. Radu got along just fine at the Ottoman court. He was charming, intelligent, and good-looking, eventually even earning the title Radu the Handsome. He befriended the Sultan's son Mehmed II, and his studies in Turkish, the Quran, logic, mathematics, and philosophy flourished. Vlad, on the other hand, didn't get on so well. Neither charming nor handsome, he got none of the fawning attention Radu received, and his defiant attitude meant he regularly felt the lash of a tutor's whip. Yet while they were generally well treated, they were also in danger. A fact brought home when the brothers saw 2 boys, fellow Eastern European hostages, blinded with red-hot irons as punishment for communicating with them. As always, Vlad's great eyes saw everything. He saw the Ottoman court, memorizing its functions and ways. He observed military drills close up and was raised along with Mehmed, gaining first-hand knowledge of a future enemy. He observed the terror tactics the Ottoman states used to keep vassals and populations in line, and he learned another hard lesson, that politics wasn't personal. Betraying your family was okay if it gave you more power. Then one day, a messenger arrived, saying that Vlad and Radu's privileges were being stripped. They would now live in harsher conditions, separated from the court. For it seems their father, the dragon, knowing it would mean the death of his sons, had joined John Hunyadi in a crusade to eject the Ottomans from Europe, which didn't go very well. The Crusaders marched to total defeat, and then in the fallout, Vlad Dracul gave confusing signals of which side he was actually on. But ultimately, he resubmitted himself as a vassal to Sultan Murad, allowing Vlad Dracula and Radu, who he was surprised to learn were still alive, to come home. Yet, as I'm sure you've
greetings,
gathered by
soldier.
now, in
Welcome
making
to my
his
humble
peace,
shop.
Vlad
Please take a look at
Dracul
my
had
testing.
invited war.
And
Because
no, I
now
don't really
John
care which
Hunyadi
side
stormed
you're on.
into
Just a
Wallachia, hoping to put a pretender named Vladislav on the Wallachian throne, because this story really needed more guys named Vlad. Vlad Dracula and Radu the Handsome fled back to the Ottomans, while their eldest brother, their father, got caught by a group of rebel boyars who blinded him with a red-hot poker and buried him alive. And days later, Hunyadi and his men ran down Vlad II in a marsh. The dragon was dead, his throne given to a pretender, which meant that now, in 1448, it was finally time for young Vlad to enter Wallachia and reclaim what was his. So with military support from the Ottoman Sultan, the son of the dragon marched to his revenge, and Dracula was unleashed. Ottoman Empire, 1447. This is how Romanian folklore says it happened. When Vlad Dracul was being run down in a marsh, when he knew that he'd be caught and killed by the pretender Vladislav, he gave his sword and pendant to a loyal boyar. Take Ella to my son. For 5 days, the boyar rode, evading enemies and crossing rivers, until
greetings,
he entered
soldier.
the Ottoman
Welcome to
Empire
my humble
and
shop.
presented them
Please,
to
take a
Vlad
look at my
Dracul.
interest.
And as the
No, I
boyar
don't really
recounted
care
the
which
deaths
side
of
you're
his
on.
father and brother, Dracula stood staring at the sword and pendant, both given to his father by Sigismund, both marked with the iconography of the Order of the Dragon. And there, the 17-year-old Vlad Dracula swore that he would not rest until he had avenged his murdered kin, and that he would personally, with his own hand, slay the pretender Vladislav. While the story we started with may be folklore, it does capture a solid truth. When John Hunyadi's invasion killed Vlad's father and brother, it put the teenage hostage into play. Murad seems to have told Vlad of the deaths himself, and then followed it up by making him an officer in the Ottoman military. Because despite the greater popularity of his younger brother Radu, Vlad's seriousness and determination had convinced Sultan Murad that this was the prince they wanted ruling Wallachia as an ally. And considering how brutally Hunyadi and his allies had killed Vlad's family, Murad also assumed that any chance of the young prince defecting to the Hungarians was most likely buried alive with Vlad's older brother. Plus, it was the perfect time to reclaim Wallachia for the Dracul dynasty. For when John Hunyadi and Vladislav marched into Ottoman-held Serbia, Murad had dealt them a shattering defeat outside Kosovo. In fact, the rout was so chaotic that no one even knew if Hunyadi or Vladislav had survived. Seeing his chance, Vlad stormed into Wallachia with a Turkish cavalry force and seized the throne, a dramatic beginning to a powerful and bloody reign. Soon, Vlad would take revenge on the boyars who had betrayed his father and brother, and would carve a swath across all of the land of— Oops, sorry. Funny story, Vladislav actually turned up, both very alive and with an army, recaptured the throne, and sent Vlad back into exile. His first reign lasted all of 2 months. At first, he fled back to the Ottomans, but things weren't safe there either. Vladislav, though he'd accepted Hunyadi's help to be installed on the throne of Wallachia under the explicit agreement that he'd fight the Turks, was discovering the same thing Vlad's father had. Wallachia simply couldn't survive against the Ottomans without Hungarian aid, and Hungary was a mess. Soon Wallachian boyars pressured him to make peace with the Sultan. So he sent envoys to Sultan Murad looking to strike a deal, and Vlad, rightfully worried his death might be a condition of the bargain, fled to Moldavia. And Vlad received a warm welcome there. For that year, his uncle had become the ruler of Moldavia, and his cousin Stephen the heir apparent. And the 3 years that Vlad spent there, connecting with his cousin and getting a Renaissance education, were likely some of the happiest of his life. He even got a taste of military glory, helping his uncle and cousin turn back a Polish force. Good days. Though the time was abruptly cut short when his uncle's half-brother assassinated him, and Vlad and Stephen both fled to Hungary, where he was forced to play cat and mouse with John Hunyadi, going from town to town, hiding with sympathetic boyars, and slipping away just as a squad of ambushers tried to catch and assassinate him. Then everything changed again. First, Sultan Murad died, and in his place rose his more vigorous and ambitious son Mehmed, who declared it his top priority to finally conquer Constantinople. A goal made possible since while the city was still a trade center and symbolically important, it had declined in military power. Hunyadi's star was falling as well, while he was still revered as the most famous crusader against the Turks. His few recent defeats had tarnished his reputation. I mean, a few years before, he'd essentially ruled Hungary on behalf of the child king, but now he was back to just being a plain old prince of Transylvania. And then Vladislav. Vladislav was aligning ever closer with the Ottomans, meaning Hunyadi was suddenly shopping for a new prince of Wallachia. which set up an interesting space for an approach between Hunyadi and Vlad, because each did have something the other wanted. Hunyadi could give Vlad legitimacy, official recognition in Hungary, and a path to reclaim his throne. And in turn, Vlad could give Hunyadi an able partner who knew the Ottoman military and leadership from the inside, and who could replace Vladislav if necessary. Striking this deal, however, meant that Vlad would need to join the man who'd slaughtered his family. But in an ironic twist, Vlad's father of all people had prepared him for this decision, back when he'd abandoned Vlad as a hostage with the Ottomans. Politics was impersonal, and if reclaiming his throne meant foregoing vengeance, then so be it. Vlad became a noble at Hunyadi's court, and his new patron took him to the coronation of the new Hungarian king, Ladislaus the Posthumous, where he took an oath, formally, to act as an ally of Hungary and the Catholic Church. His role would be the same as his father's, halting the Ottomans' advance and reclaiming Christian lands. And with his oath sworn, the Hungarian Diet charged Vlad with defending the Transylvanian frontier against the Ottomans and their Wallachian allies, a duty his father also held. News of Constantinople's fall in 1453, while no surprise, did sour the celebrations. Stories had filtered in that the Ottomans had impaled prisoners in front of the city walls, a punishment used by both Ottomans and German Saxons as a way to scare the garrison into surrender. Believing the city would fall, and wanting to preserve his strength for defending his own territory, Hunyadi opted against sending troops to Constantinople. But he knew that Mehmed would not start with the bastion of Eastern Christians, and the next place on the chopping block would be the Hungarian frontier city of Belgrade. So in 1456, he whipped up an army of mercenaries and marched to relieve the city, leaving Vlad to defend the pass into Transylvania and keep Vladislav tied down. Hunyadi's forces reached Belgrade just as the city was ready to fall, broke through the Turkish lines, and managed to get inside the citadel to reinforce the beleaguered garrison. They broke the siege, repelling Mehmed's forces after weeks of combat. Hunyadi, the White Knight who had fought the Ottomans, had relieved Belgrade, an event described as a miracle. But a miracle that went sour, as plague swept into his camp, killing Hunyadi and the expeditions of the day. But Vlad Dracula had little time to mourn the enemy mentor, for his goal had been to tie up Vladislav's forces, and he knew the best way to do it: invasion. As he crossed into his homeland, he looked up to see a fell star burning in the heavens, Halley's Comet, a celestial body that people across the world interpreted as either a sign of impending catastrophe or great events. And meeting his enemy's army outside the Wallachian capital of Polish, Vlad took the burning star as a sign of coming victory. We know little about what happened next. According to one story, the relatively small armies clashed, but in another, the forces decided to settle the issue by single combat. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, against his cousin Vladislav, Prince of Wallachia. Though in both versions, Vlad slays the pretender with his own hand. When he took the throne, his coins were stamped with the five-tailed comet, the symbol of his victory. But that victory would be difficult to hold on to, because while he agreed to pay Mehmed 2,000 gold as tribute and agreed to let the Ottoman armies cross his lands, these agreements were only to buy time for him to build and repair more fortresses and solve internal problems at home. For the faction of boyars who had brought him to the throne were a small minority of the nobility. Most had supported the slain Vladislav, including those who had risen up and killed Vlad's brother at the prompting of John Hunyadi. Indeed, it was only months into his second reign when a young boyar raised an army of mercenaries to dethrone the young prince. But Vlad ambushed the little band as they marched toward Targovishta and made an example of them no one would miss. His troops sharpened long stakes, greased them, and then shoved them into the bodies of the noble and all his male kin. Then he left them, still living beside the road to die over the coming days. Over time, he would refine this gruesome method of execution until history remembered him chiefly for the brutal spectacle. Vlad the Impaler had arrived, and his enemies would suffer. Targovishta, Easter, 1457. The Wallachian boyars are feasting at Vlad Dracula's table. In their fine Easter clothes, they raise toasts to their new prince. The past, they say, is forgotten. But Vlad does not forget. Suddenly, there's a commotion, and soldiers begin grabbing their arms. Vlad then separates the boyars and their families who had risen against his father and buried his brother into the stream. while the others are force-marched down to a town below a ruined mountain fortress and told to pick up the freshly made bricks there. They will carry the bricks up the mountain, rebuilding Vlad's new castle for the rest of their short lives. Their fine clothes tearing and falling away until they're nearly naked, and most work until they collapse and die. Ah, but who cares if the boyars perish from frostbite and exhaustion, huh? Vlad is the prince, and he can appoint new nobles.
Now, if you watched the first 2 chapters of this video and thought,
I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone. Bring on the
New York City, 1942.
I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone. Bring on the impaling! After this episode,
Greetings, soldier. Welcome to
because
my
this part
shop.
of the tale
Please
contains
take
like
a
a
look at my interesting.
bajillion% more
Go
impalings
to the
and
care
violence.
which side you're on.
Seriously, it's
Just so long as you
a
feel my
lot.
pockets, eh?
So please let this serve as a content warning for everything that follows, because this one's going to get through. But before we go there, I want to take a slight break and talk about state violence during this era, since it's important to understanding Vlad, his times, and how he's remembered. The 15th century was a particularly bloody time in Europe, one where violence was commonplace in everyday life. Few laws governed warfare, and rebellions often ended with massacres or mass executions. And it was common all over Europe to keep populations
greetings,
in line
soldier.
with displays
Welcome to
of
my humble
extreme
shop.
violence.
Please
As this
take a
was an
look at my
era of
interest here.
gory public executions
I
and
don't really
torture.
care which side
English
you're on,
kings put
just
heads
so long
on
as you fill
spikes,
my pockets,
French
eh?
ones broke people on the wheel, and the Spanish had the Inquisition. In other words, public displays of cruelty were a form of political communication. We say this not to
you can't
excuse
afford
Vlad.
it.
Actually, if
Well,
anything,
sorry,
it does
soldier.
the opposite.
I cannot give
Because
credit.
even by
Come back when
these
you're in a
standards,
bit
his
richer,
campaigns
eh?
of violence were considered extreme. While we don't have a lot of primary source documents on Vlad, and things written about him or preserved orally are likely exaggerated, there is a clear theme that emerges when we look at his second reign. When he gained the throne in 1457, Vlad embarked on a planned, deliberate campaign to break the power of the boyars, which had been on the rise since the time of his grandfather. In fact, the instability of the Wallachian throne was not all due to outside interventions by Hungary and the Ottomans. It had as much, if not more, to do with the Wallachian boyars, who always tried to steer the weakest candidate to the throne and increase the power of their own council. Vlad, on the other hand, tended toward the aristocratic, centralized version of power that was on the rise in the Renaissance. In Vlad's mind, it would be he who controlled Wallachia, not the boyars and not the church. And the only way to keep the throne would be to become as powerful as possible. You can judge for yourselves, he explained in a letter to the Transylvanian town of Brasov. When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a strong man will come and do what he wants to him. His first act was to purge the boyars of any deemed unfaithful or ambitious, frequently executing them via impalement. Between 1457 and 1461, he replaced all but 2 boyars in his royal council, a body that rarely changed, even as the prince did, suggested he likely surrounded himself with loyalists. Those loyalists came from a lower strata of the boyar class, while others were mercenaries or followers from his exile in Transylvania. Basically people that owed their elevation directly to Vlad, and who often had no previous ties or allegiances in Wallachia. And the wealth and land that Vlad gave them had, conveniently enough, been provided by their predecessors, who didn't need it anymore. He also instituted a campaign of terror in order to enforce public order. Now, we have to be cautious when discussing this, since first-hand records about his domestic massacres are lacking, and those written by outsiders, based on reports within the country, likely include some exaggeration. But even Romanian oral traditions that are kind to Vlad, casting him as tough but fair, still emphasize his extreme cruelty. Thieves were beheaded, unfaithful wives skinned alive, lazy peasants impaled, Roma people forced into the military or boiled alive. A Romanian folktale tells of how he threw a banquet for beggars, then locked the doors and burned the hall down to stop them burdening the state. And several accounts discuss him impaling priests who did not show him suitable respect. In another story, 2 diplomats, in some versions representatives of the Ottomans, in others Genoese Italians, once said it was against their custom to remove either their turbans or skull caps before Vlad. So, he supposedly honored this tradition by having their head coverings nailed to their skulls. And while we can't verify the truth of all these stories, they all share common points. They portray a ruler who is trying to assert not only his own authority, but who wants to enforce a strict moral code, emphasizing hard work and deference to authority. They also suggest a tendency towards sadism. But the massacres reached a new height when it came to the Transylvanian town of Brajov, which he had wrote to early in his reign, promising his protection if they agreed he could retreat there in the event of being dethroned. Though relations between Vlad and Brajov got rocky fast. See, Brajov was the center of German-Saxon settlement in Transylvania, and a major location for trade and manufacturing. And while it happily sent Vlad artisans, it was also under pressure from Hungary, who by this point realized Vlad was not going to be a Hungarian vassal, to throw their support behind one of Vlad's relatives instead. Two of which, just happened to be hanging around Saxon Transylvania, waiting for their moment, including Vlad's half-brother, Vlad the Monk. Because again, this series needed more guys named Vlad. Vlad kept up the dance of diplomacy with the Transylvanian Saxons for a couple of years, ordering them to expel the pretenders, and occasionally carrying out reprisals to make it happen. But by 1459, when the Saxons recognized a third pretender, his patience ran out. He rounded up 41 Brajov merchants living in Wallachia and impaled them. Then he had 300 other Saxons burned alive, claiming that some were spies. Then he led a two-pronged attack into southern Transylvania, burning towns and attacking the outskirts of Brajov before withdrawing. This attack killed thousands and remains one of Vlad's most infamous acts. In retaliation, the Saxons of Brajov threw their full support behind another one of Vlad's relatives, Dan the Pretender, to make a try for the throne. And just from the fact that history remembers this guy as the Pretender, you could probably guess that did not go well. Captured after a brief battle, Dan supposedly knelt while his grave was dug in front of him. All the while, a priest conducting a burial service while the terrified man was still alive, all of which climaxed when an executioner's axe fell, dropping the Pretender's head into an open pit. 3 years into his second reign, Vlad had, through utter brutality, achieved many of his goals. He terrorized the boyars into submission or replaced them, strengthened his power, and created a spectacle of gold so incredible that both pretenders to the throne and foreign enemies along the border would think twice about trying to unseat the son of the dragon. And so he turned to foreign policy, the Ottomans. Though Vlad started his reign by paying Mehmed financial tribute, that first payment was the only one he'd sent. And by 1461, he was 3 years past due, and Mehmed was looking for a medium to clear up the diplomatic frostiness. The envoys of Mehmed came in force, a Greek diplomat and a Turkish commander at their head. They had planned to capture Vlad, much like Murad had captured Vlad's father. Instead, Vlad's army came into hiding, surrounding the Turkish force, and upon marching them back to Targovishte, the Ottomans had a stake erected for each one, with 2 higher than the others, one for the Greek diplomat and one for the Turkish commander. Within weeks, Vlad's army was across the Danube River, ravaging Turkish territory, impaling thousands of prisoners and burning civilians in bombs. Vlad was going to war against the Ottoman Empire, a clash that would prove a reunion. For leading the Turkish army against him was his childhood companion Mehmed, and at the Sultan's right hand, someone even closer to home, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Oh boy. In 1461, the Danube. Vlad Dracula puts pen to paper to tell his ally Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, about how many he has killed attacking Ottoman territory. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians in all, not including those who were burned in their houses and whose heads were not presented to our officials. But he also writes, this will lead to an all-out war with Mehmed. When the weather permits, that is to say in the spring, they will come with evil intentions and with all of their power. And when they did, Vlad would find himself fighting alone. Vlad's attack on Ottoman territory across the Danube River didn't just come out of nowhere. He knew that his brother Radu was still on the Ottoman court, just in case Vlad needed to be replaced, and he was aware of Mehmed's expansionist designs. Indeed, it was obvious to everyone an attack was coming, because a few years earlier, Pope Pius II and the Venetians had raised money in order to fund a crusade that would prevent further Ottoman expansion. While Matthias Corvinus Frederick III, and other rulers had taken the Pope's money. Because, free money, they were slow to actually do anything productive with it. Because while most European monarchs talked a big game about defending against the Muslim Turks, the reality was that for most kingdoms, their Christian neighbor states were a much more credible threat. In fact, in desperation, Pope Pius reached out to other Muslim states in hopes of convincing them to attack the Ottomans to keep the men tied down. Plus, Vlad had his own border troubles, namely his cousin Stephen, who he helped put on the throne of Moldavia. But now Stephen had switched sides and became an Ottoman vassal, massing his troops on Vlad's borders so that if the Ottomans came, Vlad would have to fend off armies from two directions. That came to pass in 1462, when one night, Mehmed and Vlad's brother Radu led Ottoman forces across the Danube and into Wallachia. Vlad opposed it with a battery of cannons, but when the Ottomans raised their own artillery positions and began firing back, he withdrew. Vlad was simply outnumbered and outnumbered. Mehmed had between 60 and 70,000 troops and 120 cannons, whereas Vlad could only muster 10,000 soldiers in his main force, most of them peasants rather than professionals. Now, a word of caution here. While we do know what happened in this war, there's still debate about the location, order of events, and what Vlad and Mehmed's strategic objectives were. Mehmed, for his part, probably didn't want to outright conquer Wallachia and bring it into the empire. It was more valuable to him as a country, but of course was more to do with Also, he was interested in the Saxony fortress, whereas Vlad, of course, wanted to stay on the throne and expel Mehmed from his lands. But he did know he couldn't beat Mehmed in the field, so instead he used guerrilla tactics. He sent word for Wallachian civilians to flee to the Carpathian Mountains, then retreated, burning the land behind him and poisoning water sources to deny the Ottoman army food. Then, his horsemen harried Mehmed's column, striking and disappearing, occasionally taking captives, waiting for a moment to land a hard blow. Which came when the Ottoman army camped outside of the capital of Targovishta, not noticing the spies passed in their midst. According to folklore, one of those spies was in fact Vlad himself, using his command of Turkish to pass himself off as a soldier. And whether true or not, the scouts learned what they needed to know: the location of Mehmed's tent. Wallachian cavalry screamed into the unaware Ottoman force, slashing down with swords and burning canvas tents, killing hundreds in the shock assault before many in the Ottoman camp could even pick up weapons. And Vlad stormed through the melee, slicing his way into Mehmed's personal tent to find it empty. Mehmed happened to be somewhere else. Vlad called a retreat. His planned decapitation strike had failed. The next day, the armies finally met in earnest, where Vlad lost 2,000 soldiers and abandoned the capital to the men, running with his shattered army through the safety of the mountains. But he left something behind. As Mehmed and Radu approached Targovishta, their troops saw what from a distance looked like a stand of trees. That is, until they got closer. They were bodies. Ottoman captives from Vlad's depredations along the Danube, and the soldiers he'd snatched during the guerrilla campaign. Men, women, children, all impaled in a macabre display, with birds nesting in their corpses. One account puts the number at 20,000, roughly the amount Vlad himself had claimed to kill in his letter to Matthias Corvinus. But while this terror tactic did shake the approaching Ottoman troops, it actually opened another avenue for Mehmed. He had, after all, brought his favorite Radu the Handsome to replace Vlad, and Vlad's long-standing campaigns of public cruelty and his war on the boyars had not exactly endeared him to what was left of Wallachian nobility. So with Vlad on the run, clearly defeated, boyars increasingly defected to Radu. The new prince, now enthroned at Targovishta, quickly reached out to elements Vlad had clashed with, like the Transylvanian Saxons. A great warrior he was perhaps not, but he was a cunning enough diplomat to offer himself as a more reasonable alternative to his vicious brother, even if he was an Ottoman puppet. Vlad was defeated, out of power, his troops likely deserting in increasing numbers. The only upside was that his fortress on the Black Sea had withstood a siege by both Stephen and Mehmed, but that was cold comfort. And within weeks, Vlad's support had melted to the point that Mehmed went home, leaving Radu to run things, secure on his new throne. Now hiding in the Carpathian Mountains, Vlad had but one hope. See, there was rumor that his old ally, Matthias Corvinus, was marching towards Wallachia with a Hungarian army. So Vlad dispatched messages begging for aid in regaining his throne. And Corvinus came with a pair of shackles. See, Corvinus didn't necessarily want to battle Mehmed at that moment, but the Pope and Venetians had, after all, given him all all that nice money to fight the Ottomans with, and it just seemed like such a waste to use it fighting the Ottomans, you know? But he did have to show he'd done something, so he arrested Vlad, producing several forged letters to prove that Vlad had been collaborating with Mehmed, offering to make war on Hungary in exchange for regaining his throne. And no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, even Corvinus' court historian seems to think it was a little thin. But Corvinus needed to show the Pope a victory, and uncovering Vlad's treachery was a way to do that without expending his military. So Vlad was a prisoner once again, and would remain one for 14 years. We have little documentation on Vlad during this period, apart from the fact that he was held for a few years and then allowed to settle in a house in Pest, transitioning from being strictly a prisoner to more of an exiled noble, forbidden from leaving the country. Though among the few stories we have about him during this time is one violent incident involving Hungarian troops. Apparently, a thief had run and hid in Vlad's home, and then when a squad of troops burst in to pursue him, Vlad had their leader executed on the spot. He'd argued, successfully, that he was within his rights because the troops had not asked for an invitation. Meanwhile, as Vlad stewed, causing a few diplomatic incidents in Pest, Radu lost the throne to another rival, and when the news hit a clearly restless Vlad, he pushed Corvinus to give him an army to recover Wallachia. Because remember, according to Corvinus, Vlad was still the legitimate prince, and Vlad argued he could be useful. But while Corvinus still refused for years to support Vlad, he did increasingly give his pet Wallachian prince a longer and longer leash, letting him move around within Hungary and settle in Transylvania, giving him clearance to gather followers around him, staging Vlad across the border, exactly like all those pretenders had done during Vlad's rule. Corvinus was testing Dracula, seeing if he could trust him. And in 1476, the biggest test came, when he sent Vlad along on military expeditions against the Ottomans in Bosnia, and to bail Vlad's cousin Stephen out when his relationship with Mehmed soured and the Sultan invaded Moldavia, though it was only a prelude. Within months, a Hungarian army was marching on Budapest, and Vlad and Stephen, armies now united, barely missed capturing the deposed prince as he fled to Mehmed. So in November 1476, Vlad once again became the Prince of Wallachia. In his life, he'd been a hostage, a fugitive exile, a prince, a captive, a general, and both a rebel and an oppressor. He'd carried his sword for the Ottomans, Hungarians, Moldavians, a pope, and a sultan. Now in his mid-40s, it would be his third reign as prince. And though it would only last 2 months, Vlad would live forever. 1476, Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmed the Conqueror. He brings news of a victory against the tyrant Vlad III, who has massacred the faithful and spurned Mehmed's friendship. But the messenger didn't come alone. He carries a box, which upon its opening reveals the head of the treacherous, slain son of the dragon. Or at least that's what one story says. Because like many of the stories in the series, the accounts of how Vlad died are contradictory. We just know that 2 months into his third reign, he fought a battle with the Ottomans and lost. In fact, it's kind of ironic that given all of the excruciating detail we have about how Vlad killed his foes, we know little about his own death. But death was not the end of Vlad Dracula. Because if there's one truth about human culture, it's this. When history doesn't provide a fitting end to a historical life, legend's gonna step in to finish the job. And Dracula refused to stay in the grave. Despite his relatively brief time on the throne of Wallachia, less than 7 years in total, at the time of Vlad Dracula's death, he was already casting an outsized shadow over history. For instance, do you remember back in episode 3 when we talked about the parade of cruelty and massacre during Vlad's second reign? Well, one of those incidents that might have gotten lost in the sheer cacophony of awfulness was Vlad's massacre of Transylvanian Saxons in Brasov, an act that had huge consequences. See, those Saxons were German, and while they had come to the area a couple of centuries before, they still had family and trade ties with their homeland, which in the mid to late 15th century was one of Europe's greatest centers of printing and publishing. Now, many early books and pamphlets printed in Europe essentially functioned as political and religious propaganda. And after his massacres of Saxons in Brasov, Saxon printers made Vlad a favorite villain in their printings. Meaning, as Vlad cooled his heels as a captive in Hungary, he was becoming internationally famous for cruelty and butchery, a portrayal that only escalated after his death. Now, it's important to note that many of these stories printed about Vlad were exaggerated, and a bunch likely not true at all. In fact, we've been very careful to not draw on them too much as sources, and label said sources appropriately in the rare times that we do. Because while this genre of writing was originally intended to smear one's enemies, it also became a sort of early horror literature. Even as far back as the 15th and 16th centuries, the general rule for publications was, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning, stories of blood and guts sold well, particularly if they came along with gruesome woodblock prints. Even ostensibly serious religious books, like the 1563 publication Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, would get spiced up with lurid scenes of Protestants getting tortured or burned at the stake. Also, Catholic art and publications had a similar fascination with violent imagery, and the existing stories about Vlad served as a perfect jumping-off point for German authors to create stories about him doing, well, basically any twisted thing they could imagine. The Ottomans, similarly, were happy to preserve stories about Vlad's awfulness, since it justified removing him and made Hungary look bad for supporting him. Early biographers also played a part in this mythologizing, though sometimes to Vlad's benefit. For example, a Greek biographer who appreciated Vlad's years fighting the Ottoman Empire while acknowledging Vlad's cruelty also went out of his way to try and discredit Radu. This included claims that Radu converted to Islam, which is debatable, and that he and Mehmed were actually a gay couple, a portrayal historians also find suspect since it only exists in one very anti-Ottoman source. But before you come at us, all you Mehmed Radu stans, we're not saying this wasn't a thing, just that it's not totally established fact. Ooh, but you know what is a fact? Until this very series, Rob didn't know that people actually shipped historical figures. But now he can't unknow it. Anyway, one important thing to consider is that despite all of the things said about Vlad, he was never, in any sense, accused of being a vampire. That was the work of Irish writer Bram Stoker, who ran across accounts of Vlad as he prepared to write a vampire novel that would marry Romanian folklore with 19th century technology and medical knowledge. Now, exactly how much inspiration Stoker took from Vlad has been hotly debated among historians. There are those who argue that he did extensive research on Romania, its folklore, and its history. Libraries he used have discovered margin notes in books on the subjects, and Jonathan Harker's journey into the Carpathian Mountains is broadly correct in its descriptions of routes, terrain, and even some local beliefs. Also in the novel, Stoker's Dracula even talks about raiding across the Danube and fighting the Ottomans in his life. But then the discovery of Stoker's notes in the 1970s turned a lot of these theories on their heads. Now, historians generally agree that Stoker knew little of Romania and essentially copied Harker's route and descriptions of the countryside from a 19th century travel guide. His descriptions of Dracula don't match Vlad at all, and he drew upon previous English vampire novels as much as Romanian folklore. His notes, in fact, don't even contain the name Vlad III. They do, however, seem very excited about the fact that several princes were from a family line called Dracula. So excited, in fact, that in his notes he actually scrawled, "Dracula in Wallachian means devil," with Dracula and devil in all caps. In other words, he probably just liked the name, but didn't really know what it meant. Which actually was understandable, because by the 19th century, the word for devil and dragon had become interchangeable in Romania. Plus, the local folklore of the time had forgotten the Order of the Dragon connection, claiming that Vlad was called Dracula for his cruelty. But even though his knowledge on the references he drew from and translation of the name of its title character is flawed, let's also try to remember that Stoker originally named his vampire Count Wampir and titled the book simply The Undead. I know, Zoe, I wouldn't watch Christopher Lee in that either. So that's how the outside world knew Vlad the Impaler. From Stoker's moderately successful novel, to blockbuster play, television and film adaptations, to Halloween costumes, games, and a whole tourism industry in Romania centered around Dracula's castle. A castle that Vlad probably never visited and that Bram Stoker never saw. But don't let that stop you from going, actually, because it's still a pretty freaking cool castle. But that international fame is only half the story. Because while everyone outside Romania saw Vlad as either a psychopath or blood-drinking Victorian monster, Romania itself had its own view. To speak very broadly, in the century after Vlad's death, Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman tributary states, whereas Transylvania remained independent for 2 centuries before falling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times, between 2 and 3 of the kingdoms shared the same monarch, drawing them closer together. Then by the 19th century, the 3 had enough of a shared sense of identity that they launched a series of simultaneous rebellions with the goal of independence. Finally, in 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, Wallachia and Moldavia united to form Romania and later added Transylvania after World War I. And a core component of 19th century nationalism was drawing historical heroes out from history. And at a time when Wallachia and Moldavia were struggling for independence from Ottoman rule, Vlad the Impaler fit the mold of a hero that spoke to the present issue. In Romania, he was seen as a brutal but fair ruler who kept Wallachia independent for a time and died defending his land from greater powers. Now, if you've watched all this series, you've probably concluded that Vlad cared more about gaining and keeping personal power than any noble cause. But as is often the case with nationalistic heroes, this was ignored in favor of a story that fit more neatly with 19th century Romanian politics. The image of Vlad as an independence fighter, doing what had to be done to keep his kingdom independent from the Ottomans, just felt true at the time, and turned Vlad into a national symbol. Though to be fair, even though Vlad remains a celebrated figure in modern Romania, many Romanians continue to debate over whether the country should really be proud of him. Who'd have thunk it? This stuff's complicated. But all of these disparate opinions of Vlad's story only serve to make it more interesting. From a life that was messy, often confusing, and of, let's just say, ambiguous loyalties, later writers have crafted Vlad into everything from a nationalist icon, to horror character, to folklore figure, to literary vampire, and to bait for tourist traps. Meaning, he's a fascinating study in how, if you're famous enough, one day you may end up rising from your grave to become something else entirely. Which makes you want to take a good look in the mirror. New York City, 1942.
Turn the place you live into the home you love with Bob's Discount Furniture. Shop Bob's for everyday low prices on family-proof sofas, beautiful bedrooms, delightful dining sets, lush mattresses, and more. So stop in, save big, and start to build your dream home at Bob's.
Huddersfield, Yorkshire, 1848. When they enter the house, the masters divide people by gender, separating parents from children, husbands from wives, even siblings. Unwed women are clothed in yellow dresses to make them stand out, and one of the male staff leers at a young woman who just arrived. These people have been promised beds and food, but they find the thin mattresses already filled with bodies, showing from typhoid and smeared in their filth.
Greetings, welcome to my shop. Please take a look.
But soon men will come to sell that body to the surgeons. It's the kind of place that would later inspire Charles Dickens. But those living here toil for the privilege, doing monotonous jobs like picking apart tarred rope or crushing bones for fertilizer. They work because that's what this
Greetings,
is. It
soldiers.
is a
Welcome
workhouse,
to me on the
one
shop.
of the worst.
Please take a look.
These people have committed
No, I don't really care which side
Rather,
you're on,
it is
just
a
so long as you feel
that
like
is
it's
poor and asking for help.
Enjoy the soup. If you ate it myself, it's quite cool.
Thanks so much to Give Directly for making this extra history episode possible. What they do is deliver your donations as cash to people in need, empowering them. The first thing the farmer notices is the smell. An earthy rot in the field. The Irishman walks into his potato field to find the plants turning brown and wilting. He digs up the tuber and finds it slimy like a bar of soap. When he slices it open, brown mucus oozes out. The whole crop is the same. It'll be a hungry year, but he will survive because this isn't Ireland in the famine year of 1845. It's the United States 2 years earlier. And this man has no idea how this blight will devastate the country of his birth. But before we continue today's historical tale, we're going to take a moment to thank our patrons over on Patreon. Not only help make all of our videos possible, but who also vote on topics we cover, like they did with this extra history complete on the Irish Potato Famine you're watching right now. To learn how you can vote on the shows we make, click the link below. The Irish Potato Famine ranks as one of Europe's worst agricultural disasters. An event so momentous that it not only defined a generation, it scattered a people to the winds. When the blight arrived in 1845, Ireland had a population of 8.2 million. Within a decade, though, a third of it was gone. Around 1.1 million died from starvation and disease, while 2 million emigrated abroad. Actually, you know what? Strike that. Emigration isn't the right word. It was flight. Plain and simple. An evacuation.
During the height of the famine years, when children's mouths were stained green from eating grass and dogs scavenged graveyards, people brawled on the docks for space aboard the overcrowded vessels. Most didn't even care where the ship was headed, as long as it wasn't Ireland. Yet Ireland was not the only country, or even the first, to experience the blight. The fungus responsible emerged in the United States in 1843, hitching a ride to Europe in cargo holds. Farmers attempting to strengthen European potato strains may have even accidentally imported it when they crossbred their potatoes with American stock. And strengthened by a rainy summer and carried by the wind, the fungus stormed the continent. During the summer of 1845, news of the blight filled European newspapers. Belgium had lost 87% of its potato crop, Flanders 92%, Holland lost 70%. Germany and France got off relatively light, only losing a fifth of their harvest. Rumors of starvation leaked out of Russia and Poland, while English farmers saw similar devastation. Governments prepared for a season of hunger and instability. The potato, after all, was the staple diet of Europe's emerging industrial working class. This miracle plant, imported from Peru, could produce 2 to 4 times more calories per acre than grain. Cheap and easy to prepare, it allowed Europe's shrinking agricultural sector to feed its booming manufacturing workforce. And between 1750 and 1850, the European population nearly doubled, partially due to the potato. Any threat to the potato crop was a serious problem. In fact, these crop failures would help spur the wave of revolutions that racked Europe in 1848. But here the story of Ireland diverges, because while all these countries experienced economic hardship and social change, Ireland alone starved. The reasons for that are complicated, but they boil down to 2 factors. The first was a land system that made Ireland uniquely vulnerable to a crop failure. And the second factor was human. A group of British leaders governing from London who saw the famine relief as a vehicle for reforming the Irish economy and instructing the people's moral character. Throughout the crisis, British policymakers would make economic reform their primary objective, with saving lives as a distant secondary goal. The blight indeed was, as British politicians argue, an act of God, unstoppable and inevitable. The famine, by contrast, was the work of men. But that was still to come. In the summer of 1845, British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel was tracking reports of blight. He worried about it striking England, of course, but he knew that if it took hold in Ireland, the result would be catastrophic. Technically, Ireland had been a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland since 1801, but in a practical sense, it had been the very first step in the British colonial empire. The English had ruled it directly or indirectly for centuries. In that time, the British Crown had gradually dispossessed native Irish Catholic families, confiscating their land and gifting it to English and Scots Protestants who were considered more reliably loyal, while Catholic countries sponsored a series of Irish revolts against the Protestant English, and tensions grew. The climax came when Oliver Cromwell reconquered Ireland after a rebellion, completing the process of land confiscation and totally replacing Irish landowners with English and Scots, the so-called Anglo-Irish. And it was bloody. Conservative estimates suggest that Cromwell's invasion, along with the famine it caused, may have killed 10% of the Irish population. To prevent another uprising, Cromwell and later British governments passed a series of penal laws restricting Catholic rights. Catholics could not hold public office, own firearms, or be admitted to the bar as lawyers. They couldn't own a horse worth over 5 pounds, vote, teach school, or marry a Protestant. There were restrictions on how they could own land, and when willing land to children, they couldn't give it intact to the eldest, and had to break it up equally among all their children. Churches couldn't be built of stone and had to sit far from roads, and they couldn't attend universities at home or abroad. And 80% of the Irish population was Catholic. These laws were designed to bar Irish Catholics from all forms of political and economic advancement. And while they were gradually repealed, the last vanishing in 1829, it would take generations for the Irish to recover economically. And on top of that, these landlords charged astronomical rent on the land, barely allowing the native Irish farmers to survive. And the whole thing took place in a system of middlemen so convoluted that, okay, here's an analogy. Imagine someone owns an apartment building today. That's the landowner. They don't want to manage it, so they pass it off to a middle person to manage. Now the middle person wants to make a profit and knows there's a lot of demand, so they jack up the rent. And to make more profits, they subdivide some of the larger apartments into smaller ones. Now, under the pressure of making this exorbitant rent, some of the building's tenants start to get roommates or rent some of their bedrooms on Airbnb, further subdividing their own apartment. Wow, this sounds really familiar. Oh, hi NYC, I see you in this analogy. Anyway, that's basically what happened to Irish farmers. In fact, some of the landowners, known as absentee landlords, hadn't even lived in Ireland for generations. The trend was bad. Then events made it worse. During the Napoleonic Wars, Irish goods suddenly became a major part of British imports, as the war cut off suppliers in France. Things improved for the Irish, with many turning to new manufacturing jobs. But then, Napoleon was defeated. French goods returned, and the burgeoning industrial sector collapsed. Out-of-work weavers and tradesmen flooded the country.